Um, Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. I think we'll just wait maybe just a couple of other minutes. We'll start at 5 minutes past 4 Kenyan time, Southern Africa, other parts of Africa, but just in about 2 minutes, as we see a few more people strolling in. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. So we'll get started now with our webinar today. My name is Elias Zulu. I'm going to be the moderator of the webinar that we are having today. So welcome all of you, and thanks a lot for sparing your time. My name is Elias Zulu. As I said, I work at AFIDEP. AFIDEP, the African Institute for Development Policy. Our main sort of mandate is to make evidence matter in policy formulation and policy implementation in Africa, basically to make sure that we promote a culture or institutionalize a culture of evidence-informed decision-making, to make sure that at all times when there's decision makers are making decisions on what priorities to set, how much money to put in this versus that activity or sector and so on, they should be using evidence. So that's why when Ian Goldman asked me a few weeks ago for AFIDEP to host this webinar, I was very, very happy to say yes. Not only because I was on the committee, on the advisory committee for the book, but also because this book actually is a big milestone in the ongoing efforts to promote a culture of evidence-informed decision-making in Africa. The book itself, with the title "Using Evidence in Policy and Practice: Lessons from Africa," which has been edited by Ian Goldman and Mine Pabari, is indeed a big milestone. Those of us who work in the field of promoting evidence use in decision-making, one of the big questions that policymakers ask, or other people for that matter ask, is what are there examples of cases where use of evidence actually led to a better policy outcome? And so when this book came up to really look at to ask governments in Africa, the book asks governments in Africa to see how evidence use has actually improved their policies. And it has documented a few case studies ranging from all corners of the continent, from 5 countries, including from ECOWAS. So the book is also supported by a lot of materials. So those of you who are interested in promoting evidence use, you are a researcher, you are a policymaker, it's really a very, very important resource for understanding how you can practically promote evidence use in decision making. So I would like to congratulate Ian Goldman and Mine Pabari for their achievement in putting together this really wonderful and very, very timely book. The purpose of our webinar today is it's actually a third in a series of webinars that Ian and Mine are organizing to launch specific chapters of the book. So 2 webinars have happened already in the past. This is the 3rd one. And this webinar is focusing on a case study for chapter 10, which was entitled Parliament and Public Participation in Kenya. It's a book that explores the role of Parliament in public policy making through citizen engagement and public participation drawing on experiences from the review and enactment of the Kenya Wildlife Conservation and Management Act of 2013. So I'll not go into to say any more about the book or the chapter itself, because two co-authors of the chapter. The chapter is actually co-authored by five people. The lead author is Mine Pahari, and others are Yemeresak Tesema, Amina Abdallah, Jude Wakungu, Ahmed Hassan Ahoa himself, who is a co-presenter today, and Ali Kaka. So I'll shortly introduce the presenters here, but just some sort of guidelines on how we are going to go. They will do a presentation for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have about slightly more than an hour for a discussion, question and answer. The feature of the webinar tool that we are using today has that part there that has Q&A. It has chat, it has Q&A, it has polls, it has handouts. So we'd like to encourage you to actually be participatory. We want the webinar to be participatory, to encourage you to put your questions or comments in the Q&A as opposed to chat. The Q&A is the one that actually puts the question, and when the question is answered, throughout the discussion itself, the presenters and the authors of the book, who may not even be presenting, will actually be providing answers as we go on. So a lot of the discussion should happen through the Q&A, and once in a while, Ian Goldman himself and myself will be looking at the questions that you are asking in the Q&A, and then raising some of them to ask the presenters to respond to. But a lot of the discussion will be done through Q&A. We'll also be looking at the attendees list. If you raise your hand there, we will call upon a few people, maybe to ask your questions or give comments verbally. But that will not be a lot of people. As you know, we have over 42 people already enrolled on the webinar now, so it will only be a few people. But we want the discussion, for the most part, to happen through the Q&A. It has a good feature. When the question is answered, it actually goes to the other panel of answered questions, the others that are there. So please comment, post your own ideas, post links to your own work into there, because this is really a discussion about evidence-informed decision making, and this chapter is actually just providing a platform for us to reflect. So I'll now go quickly to do quick introductions of the three presenters who are here, starting with Ian himself, who is the lead author of the lead editor of the book. Ian Goldman is the advisor on evaluation and evidence systems at CLEAR Anglophone Africa. He was the former Deputy Director General in the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation of the Republic of South Africa. So Ian comes really a lot of experience as a researcher himself, but also somebody who has spent a lot of years, over 40 years, working in over 20 countries, but working in government during most of that time. He has also been a commissioner of the 3IE since 2012, and he was one of the founders of the Twendembele Africa M&D partnership. The second presenter, the editor and the second presenter is Mine Pahari, who is the visiting fellow at CLEAR Anglophone Africa. Mine has also had over 20 years experience in the natural resource management and sustainable development as an evaluator, as well as program manager and implementer. And between 2001 and 2004, she was responsible for monitoring and evaluation processes across a large scale of regional initiative covering 12 countries in Eastern Africa. So there's a lot that can be said about her. As I said, she's currently a visiting fellow with the CLEAR Anglophone Africa, and she's the managing partner at Athari Advisory. And last but not least is Ahmed Hassan Ahoa. Ahmed is a research fellow in the Parliamentary Research Services Department of the Kenya Parliament. He's worked in the Kenyan Parliament for 12 years. And he provides leadership and he coordinates activities and staff under the Governance and Political Affairs Division of the Kenya Parliamentary Research Services Department. His role also involves generation, review, and analysis of evidence, and helping parliamentarians and parliamentary committees to have evidence on various issues that they are dealing with. He also worked. He also served in the Senate liaison office in the past, an office that's tasked with facilitating the linkage between the Senate and other stakeholders, most notably the furthering critical linkages between the Senate and in the devolved system of government in Kenya, looking at the Senate and the county governments that have been created. I was chief of staff as well for the deputy speaker in the 10th Parliament before he went to the research department. So those are the three speakers that we're going to have. It's not about me. I think I would like now to turn the floor over to the two main presenters, who will be Mine and Ahmed. Please take it from there, Mine and Ahmed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, and good afternoon, and thank you very much to everybody for joining us this afternoon. I'll start off the presentation by introducing the project, the research project within which this case study took place, and then I'll speak briefly to the analytical framework that guided the case study research, and then we'll turn to the case study itself. So we'll start that off with a brief video on the context, and that will allow some of the other authors to have their own voices in this webinar. And then I'll hand over to Ahmed, who will walk us through the details of the case study. So to start off, the case study emerges from a research project on evidence use that was financed by Hewlett and carried out under the umbrella of CLEAR Anglophone Africa. The research, a couple of things to sort of really highlight here in terms of the research itself, is one, that the focus and the lens is very much from a demand perspective rather than a supply perspective. So we engaged through the lens of policymakers, and we carried out the research in all of the case studies. We carried out the research with policymakers as co-authors, and that offered us an interesting set of insights into evidence use. We looked at a range of different types of evidence, as you can see, some of them are listed up there, from evaluations through to citizen engagement, and that's what we're discussing here, public participation. And we're sharing the findings of the book through a variety of different means, one of which is, we're sharing the findings of the research through a variety of different means, one of which is a book that's coming out in July, and it's listed there. And the other is we have policy briefs as well, and the videos, and then this series of monthly webinars. And they will be made available following this particular webinar. These are the case studies listed here. As you can see, there's cases, as I said earlier, from a range of different types of evidence. The research took place in 6 different countries, and these included Benin, Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, and Uganda, and one which was looking at in a region, the ECOWAS region in West Africa, and that was the tobacco case. Okay. I'll spend a few moments now to discuss the analytical framework that really underpins the research across all of the case studies. The framework builds on 2 existing frameworks, one of which is the Science of Using Sciences framework, and I think one of the authors is with us, Lawrence is here. And the second is the Context Matters framework. And I'll walk you through the details of this. At this point, it's just really to emphasize that the point of the framework is not to say how evidence use should take place. and what has to happen in order for evidence use to take place, because that's highly dependent on circumstance and context. Rather, it offers we found to be a very helpful structure to guide our thinking around the evidence use journey as a whole, and really to help us unpack and investigate the different elements of this and what enabled or hindered evidence use in the different cases, and then to draw out lessons across all of these different cases. This is the framework. Now, as I said earlier, the starting point is the demand for this particular research, and the lens in which this took place is the demand for evidence. And we acknowledge and recognize, as do many authors, that evidence use and research in itself doesn't take place in a vacuum. It is influenced by a wider context. In this case, we looked at two different dimensions of that context. One was the external dimension, so the wider macro context. And this really is looking at factors, for example, what is the wider political context? Is there space for, what is the space for civic voice and civic engagement? Is the wider context in an element of crisis or transition? And that's, sorry, I'm not sure what happened to my slides. And what is the level of relationship between the different agencies that are involved in policy making, as well as between government and non-governmental entities? Internally, it starts to ask questions around the organizational culture vis-a-vis evidence use, and the extent to which there's a learning culture within the institution that's really driving the evidence journey. The influence of leadership and senior management, and a number of different elements. Then we turn to the evidence journey itself, and the core of which is at the center here in the different colored boxes. So you have the gray, the yellow, the red, and I hope we're all seeing the same colors. While we didn't, the starting point is evidence generation following the demand, and the research didn't spend a lot of time on evidence generation itself because the focus of this was evidence use. But obviously we paid some attention in terms of what were the types of evidence, what was the level of quality or the rigor of the evidence itself. And then we looked very closely at the use interventions and the change mechanisms that they trigger. Now, the important part of this was really saying that evidence use doesn't take place automatically. You don't generate the information and then suddenly use happens. You have to proactively and deliberately engage in a series of interventions that will enable that use to take place. And those interventions could be, for example, a series of capacity building workshops or knowledge brokering. In this case, that was quite significant. Or working closely with champions, or establishing structures such as steering committees or communities of practice. The interventions in unto themselves are not going to be very effective. They then have to, as I said, they need to trigger a particular change. And those are listed here. So we looked at 6 different change mechanisms. So the framework unpacks 6 different categories of mechanisms. Now, I won't go through all of them. I'll just highlight a few. Some of the more common ones that emerged across the case studies and that were of great importance in this particular case study were the element of agreement, being able to use interventions, for example, dialogue platforms and forums, to allow the different evidence users or the different evidence stakeholders to understand one another's perspectives. Being able to institutionalize evidence use was again absolutely essential. And in many of the case studies, not in this particular one, we saw the value and the importance of national evaluation systems in enabling use in terms of providing the institutional structure and framework for evidence use. Proactively building awareness and understanding of the importance and value of evidence use. And this obviously happens before you start to engage in the evidence journey itself. Through these youth interventions triggering the change mechanisms, you hope to see some of the changes starting to appear, both at individual level, but also at sort of broader organizational as well as systems change. We looked at this at three levels, or in three different aspects. One was in terms of strengthening capabilities to use evidence, influencing the motivation to use evidence, as well as creating opportunities and strengthening the opportunities to use this evidence. This then, you hope, leads to actual evidence use itself. The research saw evidence use quite broadly and looked at different forms of evidence use. So it went beyond the more common instrumental use of evidence, where you see tangible forms of use taking place in terms of changes in a policy, as we saw here, or procedures, to also exploring conceptual use or process use of evidence. So conceptual use was really influencing actors' views of a particular issue, or process use were changes that took place as a consequence of actors and stakeholders being involved in the evidence journey itself. And ultimately, you hope that this leads to developmental impact. And it's quite deliberate that developmental impact sits on the outside of the blue boxes, as well as slightly removed from the evidence journey itself, because there's quite a big leap from evidence generation, evidence use processes, evidence use itself, and the changes that we hope to see in terms of development impact. So now let's turn to the case itself. And as I said earlier, we'll start that off with a short video on the wider context within which this case took place.
At that time, I was actually the minister in charge of the project. And it was me who established the fact that we needed to improve and to modernize our Management Act in terms of wildlife, because there had been a stalemate for about 16 years with no new act. Poaching was very high at that moment. So one of the major issues I wanted to address was to increase the penalties on poaching. I also wanted to make sure that in terms of wildlife conservation was recognized also as a land use in terms of our laws. I also wanted to make sure that the role of communities that live with wildlife was also recognized in the law.
It came at an opportune time. There are certain factors that made it possible for it to propel through the process. One was we had come from elections of the members of parliament at that time to look through this piece of legislation without looking at, is it towards election? Are they, the position they take, will it be influenced?
Kenya did pass a new constitution in 2010, and part of the requirements of that constitution is that the legislature, which is parliament, should involve members of the public and affected stakeholders when they're making laws that are affecting them. So public participation is a constitutional requirement in Kenya. One of the things
can all who have their mics on mute, please,
was to
because we
move
are
the
having an
presidential
echo.
system of government. In a presidential system of government, the executive proposes and the legislature, in a very hands-on manner, changes and midwives it without somebody breathing on your neck. So this was a parliamentary-driven process once the document is tabled in the House.
Thank you very much. Let me pick it up from that context. I think the video gave a bit of context on where this particular piece of legislation happened and the prevailing situation at that time. But basically, we're speaking about the 11th parliament. So I'm a staffer in this current parliament. So the issue we're talking about is what happened in last parliament. Processes and that take place now might be different. I do not have leverage to speak about what's happening in current parliament. So kind of a disclaimer in terms of issues that are happening now. Maybe certain issues change or certain things are working, but exactly what happened in the last parliament. That parliament is no longer.
Ahmed?
Mini, does it look like Ahmed dropped, yeah?
Yes, I'm just trying to check where he's at.
Maybe if it takes long, you can just proceed, yeah?
Yes, okay.
All right, thank you.
Okay, I hope he'll come back in because his voice is quite crucial to this story, but I'll continue in the meantime. So a little bit more detail on the context within which this case took place. An important starting point in terms of understanding this is that it was situated in an environment where there was very polarized views around the sector itself. So particularly with regards to the use of wildlife, consumptive use vis-a-vis non-consumptive use. And you had a wider public that was sitting on either end of this argument. And this had really led the policy debate to a stalemate on multiple occasions. And the policy review process had been tried on and off on different occasions over the course of 16 years and failed at all of those times. At this particular time, it was led because of the change in constitution and the constitutional requirements. The review was led by a parliamentary committee comprised of members of parliament and supported by the parliamentary research services that really provided the interface between the committee and the wider public, and played very strong and very important knowledge broken roles, gathering, synthesizing evidence, and outreach to the public. The public were invited to engage and provide their submissions through public media. Ahmed seems to be coming back on. And the public engagement took place through convening of stakeholder forums for debate and discussion. Some of the more interesting nuances here in terms of these forums were closed-door forums were convened for those with polarized views to debate in front of members of parliament and really bring out their individual perspectives and opinions and share their sources of evidence. Members of parliament took it upon themselves to reach out to their constituencies, particularly those coming from wildlife-rich areas. And this was important because direct engagement really only happened at the center in the capital city, Nairobi, whereas wildlife-rich areas are far removed from the center. So the members of parliament and their outreach ensured that the voices of their constituencies was tabled for discussion. You also had the submission of joint positions by non-governmental organizations and actors, and they had been negotiating their positions over the course of the years and developing them, and had arrived at a place where they could put forward joint submissions and joint positions to the committee. The committee and the chair of the committee, which was Amina Abdallah, which you heard from earlier in the video, also had the foresight to engage Parliament very early on. So rather than open up spaces for parliamentary debate and discussion right at the very end, she created the spaces for that to take place earlier. And once the act had been passed, it was recognized, the committee recognized that there was a number of gaps in the act itself, and they continued to monitor it after the act had passed and use that information then to inform the amendments later on down the road. Ahmed, it's very nice to see you back. Maybe I can hand over to you now again. I've just gone through the evidence journey itself, and maybe you can continue from here.
Sorry about that. I don't know exactly what happened. These things happen. I think Mina has discussed about the background of this and what was happening with this particular piece of legislation being in the parliament for around 16 years, and members of parliament, specifically the members of the committee at that time, aware of the fact that this was the case. And so the stake was high in terms. The stakes were high in terms of producing results that were acceptable to all actors in this. And the question was how to do it. And one of the things that in the internal discussion of members of the committee came up was only an extensive engagement of stakeholders and getting as widespread as you can for those stakeholders could contribute to moving the process forward. So this was kind of a deliberate effort, also coming in at that time, and was something that really helped from breaking the past that hindered the progression of this particular legislation, was the new constitution that had a mandatory requirement for public participation. So it's imperative for any legislation that originated by parliament or comes through parliament to go through public participation, kind of a threshold, a legitimacy kind of. You could not pass legislation and conclude it without having public participation in it. But what wasn't there by then was how to do it and where to start it from. If you look at it, this legislation is happening in 2013. The elections just happened early 2013, and this is one of the first pieces of legislation under the new constitution that has a requirement for public participation. And what actually emerged then was to send out this to public through a memorandum, through advert in the newspaper, requiring members of public to submit either written submissions or come in person to parliament in a forum now, which was a public hearing. Either choices. If you couldn't come, then you could send what you needed to say about these proposals. But if you could come, and then there was a platform, a public hearing platform for that to happen. So certain processes then happened. Once that was out and members of public acted in the way, some of them sent written submissions, others decided to come, was to create the platform itself. But before the public hearing, what we did, of course, we work behind the scene, and this is the issue that we'll discuss later about knowledge brokerage and technical staff of parliament who supports evidence generation, summarizing evidence, and submitting members for decision, was to summarize the written submissions so that they could be used during the public hearing. In essence, those who appeared for the public hearing had the privilege of knowing what was sent to committees. What this then did was those who did not have the privilege to send submissions knew what was said. So if there are preferences that they had when they came for the hearing, and there were those who were against those preferences, then they will know. In essence, we put everything, well, I would say the committee put everything on the table. And this went on to become a deliberative process. What emerged then from this particular process, and I will in detail, without necessarily following any order, discuss this from the experience, was the act was revised. In essence, the outcome was the act was revised after 16 years, but the process to reach the outcome was so important to the committee members at that time that they had to kind of direct it and guide the process to get that outcome. and there was fundamental changes in how the sector was run. The wildlife sector at that time was kind of a very bureaucratic sector with very little engagement of citizens in terms of how the conservation itself happened. In essence, the outcome was that this was opened. Community members, pastoralist groups had a say in how this law will be applied. Instrumentally, the evidence that was generated by the stakeholders, evidence that was sent to us through those summaries and analysis, of course, we kind of add value and trying to make it fit for members to use, then helped in that act being revised. Conceptually, the processes that developed at that time, and I'm speaking about the 11th Parliament, this particular committee handled a total number of 8 legislations in the natural resource sector, environment natural resource sector. And because of the requirement of the new constitution to revise these pieces of legislation, then this particular process provided a background or something to turn back to in case of any challenge for these other pieces of legislation. So if you're talking about the Mining Act, the Water Act, the Forest Act, the Environmental Management and Conservation Act, all these pieces of legislation, the Climate Change Act, were revised by this particular committee. So this, the practices that happened then provided an experience and lesson for the committees and everybody involved in this to move those legislations also forward. The other issue that happened then, they created kind of a trust and a relationship between the members of the public and the legislators. So if, for example, when we're doing the Mining Act, the members who attended, the members of public who attended and participated in the public hearing in the Wildlife Conservation and Management Act, so that mining will happen in protected areas, then they will send submissions to the mining during the revision of the Mining Act to say, this is going to affect wildlife, this is going to affect protected areas, and this is our submission to this. So they stayed with the committee and be engaged through the process. So that relationship then continuously developed. Let me move on to the next issue. So, as I said, the whole process took a long time. So the public participation was there before, and it might have not been a constitutional requirement, but Parliament always enacted pieces of legislation, and the process was there. Stakeholders were there, NGOs and civil society who had interest in these pressure groups were there. But when what's actually contributed to this particular evidence being used? One, I just spoke about the interaction between the committee and the public, and the discussion that took place, kind of a three-way approach. There was discussion between members of Parliament and the public, and then there was discussion amongst members of public who attended this public hearing, but this time moderated by the committee itself. What this then was doing is to create a kind of a trusted relationship amongst the participants themselves, and also the members of the committee, those legislators, and the members of the public. So this trust then meant that certain issues or certain fears that existed amongst certain groups then got dispelled through this particular process, and the committee was very open with the members. We want to move this process forward. The evidence that was coming from all the groups, the weight of that evidence depended on how many times or how many stakeholders contributed to that particular evidence, not necessarily who was saying it. It didn't matter whether you are an expert in conservation or an indigenous community living next to the wildlife conservation areas. Every piece of evidence that was received was weighed according to, the impact that it will have, not necessarily who was saying it. And so that kind of equalized who was saying what for the committee. and then negotiation and arriving at joint positions. These negotiations happened during that public hearing and later on, which I will talk about it, in the sense that if a stakeholder or a member who came to this public hearing had a certain privilege or certain clauses in the legislation, and they wanted either added or deleted, then they had to tell the committee the reason for doing it and what was the trade-off. If they wanted it deleted, then what was their proposal? So in essence, this negotiation even helped the doing of the legislation itself. So by the time it was moving to the other stages, then there has members of parliament had ammunition to use and say, you know, we subjected this. I mean, members of the committee. Remember, the legislative process is it's a long process. The committee is just one of it, and then goes to the House. Provide ammunition for the committee to say we subjected this to stakeholders, to members of public, and this is their view. We make legislations on their behalf or for them, and this is what they think. And that helped in terms of committee be able to defend those proposals on the floor of the House when it reached there. Then, of course, understanding policymakers on sectoral realities, on what was happening. Public participation, in essence, contributed to the knowledge, understanding, and certainly improved the quality of the decisions the members were making at that time. So it was also not necessarily just beneficial for the stakeholders, was also beneficial for members of parliament, and of course, those of us who were supporting members of parliament at that time. And then enabling convenient access to evidence. When these submissions were sent, or even after the public hearing, then, and I'll speak about the role of knowledge brokers in this, was summarize this evidence, what was said. I put it in a brief, in a way that members could easily pick out the best argument out of what has been said through all this process. I remember there's so many members of public coming, there's so many things being said, a lot of documents being sent. So ours was to make this evidence accessible to members of parliament in a way that was easy to use and make sense of it. So that then increased access in terms of the various pieces of evidence that were available to the committee. I'll move to the next stage. Yeah, so Mina has spoken about the framework and what was happening, and of course introduced the issue of the context, and the context under which this particular piece of legislation was happening. We're talking about the macro context and the internal context. Macro is what was happening at that time. So a number of things helped in use of evidence. One was, as I said, the constitution that came into started being implemented after 2010, and having a requirement of public participation and listening to members of public to influence pieces of legislation. Two was just after election, immediately after election. For members of parliament, this was one of the first pieces of legislation this particular committee was facilitating. So there was an issue about, what position will you take as a member of that committee, or is it tied to political party ideology? So the approach here was more bipartisan approach to facilitate the legislation itself. So that helped in terms of putting aside political party issues and working as a committee to move the legislation forward. So the timing was really important. And then at that time, we had poaching crisis. Every research that was being released about poaching at that time showed that actually reached a tipping point. And we were losing wildlife at the rate of 3%. So the growth was -3. And there was a lot of reporting in the media, a lot of civil society and pressure groups talking about this. The ministry was grappling with how to control this. And so this particular issue then contributed in terms of listening more to evidence that was being generated to help fix the sector. So that was also a crucial element of that history. And of course, the history of this legislation. So many efforts failed, and the members of that committee then were kind of motivated to reach out to wider community members to help fix it, to get all the experiences that they needed, all the information that they needed, all the data that they could get to move the process forward, and skills and experience and expertise at that time. A number of members of this committee worked in the natural resource sector, had a lot of knowledge in how these things work, brought in their skills and expertise to it also. So that also helped. And I spoke about knowledge brokering, and these are the silent group behind. I was from the PRS then, of course I am, but I'm just talking about that parliament, is to help put information together, synthesize it, facilitate to create public participation platform, and continuously communicate with stakeholders who wanted to send more documents or support their point that they were not able to support during the public hearing. When we're talking about engagement, it wasn't a public hearing. It was a continuous process until this piece of legislation went to the House and was concluded. So if there was any evidence that came afterwards, or stakeholders who wanted to bring in more evidence after that, then they had our contact, they continued to send, or they wanted to support their point. Then we welcome that. We continued to transmit that particular evidence to the committees to continue to use it for the process. I'll move to the next stage here. Well, I am not describing a linear process, an easy process that happened. I wouldn't say it was an easy process. Oh, this happened, and then we did this. No. Of course, legislation making a use of evidence is a political issue. It depends on the policy proposal on the table at that time, and also depends on the politics around it. So there are always certain barriers that hinder the use of the evidence itself, and the effectiveness and authenticity of this particular usage. And some of the barriers then, and I talked about this being one of the first pieces of legislation, public participation being a requirement, an imperative in the Constitution, but there wasn't a framework, a guiding framework on how this will be done. What was the extent of public participation should we go to? What was the threshold? Or were there a minimum threshold that we could? How many people could come to the committee to satisfy the fact that this is the enough threshold? So there are issues about, how widespread should it be? How authentic should this be? So there are a bit of challenges and barriers in terms of that. So we're moving through challenges to navigate through certain challenges to see how this worked out. Well, I'm happy it turned out well, but that particular piece wasn't very clear. And then resource limitation. Public participation processes are very expensive, and not something that Parliament can entirely afford to reach to the wider and widespread members of the public. You can't reach the 40+ million people at that time to participate. Could only send it out and see who will respond, who will come. And one of the things that give credibility to the people who responded to and those who came, then they kind of, it was on their own accord that they came. They spend their time, their resources, and appear before the committee and send these submissions. So it was important to give value to the evidence that the committee got, because of the voluntary nature of submission of this evidence. There are limited knowledge in knowledge management and learning culture. We're talking about this whole process being new in terms of, the ingraining of these public participation processes in the legislative process. And the understanding of the legislature and legislative process itself is a very complex issue for people out there. So it wasn't a clear cut. If you're not in parliament or within parliamentary system, it will not be very clear to you the process through which this legislation goes through. And so the committee took a bit of time to explain the process, how they could influence the process, whether how the evidence could hold sway in terms of influencing the decisions of the members of the committee to make decisions on the basis of the evidence then they received. And then, of course, the working of parliament is a very kind of bureaucratic institution. Constitution says you under Article 118, it's open to members of public unless there is a justifiable reason. Every member, media is allowed to come. But then when you come to parliament, they always, security officers around there, their gates, there is a fence. So this whole process and seeing members coming to stream in to give their views. These are processes that needed to be navigated through also. So a number of barriers in that particular issues. Move to the next slide. I think I'll hand over to Mina at this stage. Mina.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much for that. I think Ahmed is really, in the slides and the story, he took us through a lot of the lessons emerged in doing so. So I'm only going to focus on and unpack a couple of them. One is the importance of leadership and the right leadership. And in this case, amongst almost everybody, the majority of which we interviewed, were very, very clear in the leadership and acknowledged the role that they played. And the leadership in this case emerged from the executive as well as the legislature, which was interesting. So they worked very well together. This was the chair of the committee, as well as at that time, the cabinet secretary of the ministry. Some of the characteristics, we unpacked this further through the interviews, and some of the important characteristics of the leadership was, one, their knowledge of the sector. They had a long-standing history with the sector and understood the intricacies of it and had well-established relationships with the different players and actors within the sector. As such, they were also trusted by the vast majority, which was really quite important given the history of the policy process that Ahmed has just walked you through. They were also politically savvy, which is, I think, quite an important lesson that emerged. Ahmed has highlighted this, and we couldn't say it enough times. It was a political process, as many policy processes are. And they had to understand that political process and be able to navigate it. And perhaps most importantly is that they were very clear of the importance of public participation. And they were very clear of the elements that had not allowed it to work previously, the significance of transparency, the significance of ensuring voice to the extent possible, etc. The second lesson Ahmed has spoken to, but I'll just build on it a little bit, was this issue around the importance of adequacy of resources and skills. Public participation is, as I'm sure you've all experienced, or many of you have experienced, is resource intensive. It requires a great deal of time to do it right, and it can require a significant level of resources. Some of the implications of this, however, which emerged through the interviews, quite interesting, related much more to equity and the sense of the extent to which the evidence was perceived as being robust, and also a sense of elite capture. As the committee didn't have the resources that it needed in its entirety available to it, it was heavily reliant on those that did have access to evidence, that did have access and networks with the wider public. In this case of importance were the communities in wildlife-rich areas, and therefore it was their voice that came through strongest. They were unable to, for example, undertake a stakeholder analysis at the onset, to develop a strong stakeholder engagement plan. This was also an issue of time, as well as the resources. And then to be able to engage in deliberate outreach using a variety of different communication means, which would have been what was required. So while the the evidence stakeholders that we spoke to, and we spoke to a wide range of them in interviewing during the course of the research, while they were unanimous on the significance, importance, and value of the participation process that took place, they were also very clear on some of the gaps, and the gaps were unsurprising, yet given that this was one of the first times that this was the first time that this process had taken place under the new constitution. So some considerations for the future, and I think some of these are still continue to be, if not all of them, continue to be relevant. One was a clear legal framework established to guide public participation, underpinned by very clear principles, ensuring that strong facilitation skills are made available to the government bodies responsible for leading and guiding the policy processes. We saw that these were invaluable. We had interview respondents saying who had led previous participation processes, and essentially they said, we just opened a door and called everybody to speak, which was participation in one form, far from effective participation. The roles of knowledge brokers in policy processes, and ensuring that those roles are strengthened and that they have the necessary skills and expertise to carry them out. Developing concrete guidelines to provide a diversity of tools and processes that could be used to support participation in different contexts, and that's recognizing that there will be different contexts even within one country or one sector. And to establish better mechanisms to ensure that the wider public are aware of the participatory processes, principles and tools, and also the policy processes, and are able to gather and develop a stronger understanding of how, related to this case, Parliament functions. And in conclusion, we've already mentioned this, the value of participation in the revision of the Act was unquestioned. And I think most everyone was unanimous that without it, and had it not taken place as effectively as it did, or in the way that it did, it is very likely, in spite of the pressures, that the Act wouldn't have gone through as it did. However, it was also pointed out that the citizens and the wider public that were engaging were not apolitical in unto themselves. They also had their agendas. They also had particular issues that they wanted to see go through. They were not drawing on evidence in an objective manner. It was subjective, and in order to support their own positions. And therefore, it was highlighted that in future, the policy processes should not be entirely reliant on just the public participation processes in unto themselves, and they also need to be able to draw on different forms and wider forms of evidence. Thank you all for your time. As we've said, the book is available, will be coming out in July. And we are also continuing, as has been mentioned earlier, we'll be continuing webinars, one on each chapter next month. And next month's is also very interesting, and that speaks to the rapid response services in Uganda. So thank you, and I'll hand over now back to the moderator.
In a face-to-face sort of meeting, I would have really demanded that we give a huge round of applause for Amini and our colleague Ahmed for this excellent presentation about how the whole issue of public participation and trying to get evidence into a policy-making process, a process that, as they said, involved engaging a public that was fragmented and polarized over a 16-year period where no new policy was coming in. So this is really very, very nice, and we'll go to the Q&A. some people were asking whether maybe we need to play the video again, but maybe we'll see towards the end if we have some more time. For now, I'll just, as I said earlier on, we're encouraging everybody to type in your questions in the Q&A pillar, and the presenters, as well as some of the people who participated in the study, are asking all sorts of, answering some of the questions there. But let me read one of the questions that has been posted there by Ben Jarabi, who is saying that, and maybe I'll turn this question to Ahmed to answer. Ben says there's no inkling of evidence use among members of parliament in Kenya. Most shocking is the professional lot who throw their professionalism out of the window and instead wear and act through political lenses. What has been the experience of the Parliamentary Research Office? Would you like just to respond to that quickly, Ahmed? Basically, the point is parliamentarians look like that. People feel like parliamentarians are not interested in evidence. How has your office tried to change that? What has been the experience? Would you like to respond to that quickly?
Well, I find that's a kind of a sweeping statement. But as I made a disclaimer about what kind of questions I can respond to and what I can't. In terms of what is happening now in Parliament, I'm actively in that institution. I wouldn't say exactly those kind of words, but I'm talking about this particular piece of legislation and the process in that Parliament. From my experience in that Parliament, I'm not talking about the current one. Remember that clarification is that there is certainly use of evidence when it comes to legislations, and I will tie that also to one more question that's related to that, so that I don't come back to it. Is about how is there any framework? Yes, in part of my presentation, I said at the moment no. There is a draft framework that from the AG's office, and then there is a bill currently in Parliament trying to operationalize that Article 118 in terms of public participation in legislative process. So everything that has taken place has been kind of isolated and specific to what sector is handling to what piece of legislation. So that's my answer. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Ahmed. I think there are also several people in the audience who want to find out really how the program in Kenya balanced between the needs or the pressures of lobbyist groups and what maybe communities were putting on the table. For example, Nuruddin Hassan says, how do we ensure that lobbyists do not hijack and take advantage of the need for public participation to advance their own agenda? But also we have a similar comment from Claire Kidombo, who says that, yeah, you raised all these, what were various factors that encouraged evidence uptake in the bill, including new constitution, the fact that there was new constitution, bipartisan support, membership and leadership of the parliamentary committee, etc. And then she asked the question, how can the same process be replicated to equalize voices of lobby groups vis-a-vis local communities on a more controversial bill and in more polarized adversarial political environment? I think Violet Murunga also said, no, that's a different question. Mine, do you, Ahmed, do you want to, the issue about balancing between the pressures that are coming from groups, the pressure groups, or what you might call the lobbies, and maybe the needs of communities. How does that work out? Or how did you balance that in this process? How was that balanced?
So first thing is for those who are whether the members of parliament or knowledge brokers behind the members of parliament, is to be aware that those pressure groups exist and put mechanisms in place to ensure that they do not, I will put it, overrun the views of the communities. This particular process was kind of fortunate because it's a sector, I think, that's very close to the communities. Wildlife is a sector that everybody understands and impacts so many people, and people derive livelihood from this sector. So even if there are no pressure groups with clear understanding of these processes, they have their own indigenous and community knowledge on conservation of wildlife and how they coexisted with wildlife. And there happened to be certain groups that working with these communities. Say work with rangers, for instance, was very strong in terms of community mobilization. So apart from the pressure groups that came, there were groups representing communities that were very strong and organized during this public hearing. And they had their views, they had their preferences. And the issue was then to reach a trade-off or counterbalance the views from these pressure groups, and they came and they were there, and the ones from the community group. So putting them in one hall with no specific sitting arrangement, with no timing in terms of who will speak. So even if they organized themselves, everybody was free to speak. So they could say what they wanted to say. If they did not clearly put it, they could repeat or ask for help from somebody else. And that sitting arrangement, putting them together and debating amongst themselves, in ours told us the contentions, the debates, the tensions that existed within these groups. For us was to take notes and note the sticky issues, the contentious issues, the issues that we could isolate and say, this group are very strong about this, and this group are very strong about this. So in internal meeting of the committee, bring that to the table of the committee and say, so what do we do? What are the trade-offs on these particular issues? Also, during that process, the committee identified 2 persons from these stakeholders of public hearing. One was a person who was academic in terms of represented the pressure groups, had an understanding of the process of legislation and the sector from that perspective. And another person had the perspective of the communities and what the communities needed. So in another session, away from the public hearing, bring these 2 to the committee so that they debate there and the committee were listening, putting questions to them and see their answers and what they said about it. So it was a deliberate effort to select these 2 for another in-camera session to elaborate more on the issues that were discussed. So it's kind of how to manage it. Of course, leadership comes in this particular. Leadership that understood what was needed and the importance and the value of evidence is crucial also that could moderate this process. It's also important for any, I think, parliamentary committee.
All right, thank you, Ahmed. I think there are now, I'll tend to 3 questions that have been put on the Q&A platform there related to the evidence itself. Actually, you seem to have alluded a little bit to the question that Violet Murunga asked to say, were there some academics involved in the process? But I think related to that is the question. I think you seem to say there was a researcher that was included, but a number of people, including Resida Beg, is asking, do you have a system in place to capture the evidence received from citizens on registration? How did you capture this evidence and present it to the members in an easy to understand format? And finally, I think another question related to evidence was asked by Moranka Sudaka, who says, was any available research evidence used for the policy making? I think I'll let you, Mine, take the lead in answering this. Basically, I think the questions are asking about, I think there's been a lot of evidence was used. These are the bottlenecks. What was the specific evidence that was actually came into place here? Is there a structured mechanism in the Kenyan Parliament on how to receive evidence from the public or from researchers? And yeah, if you can just respond to that, maybe getting into the specific evidence that actually helped to get this process forward.
Okay, actually, Ahmed is better positioned to do that because he was receiving that evidence at the time. I'll speak briefly to it and then I'll hand over to him, particularly to speak on the structured process. Now, this particular sector it's a highly researched sector. It's a high stakes sector in Kenya. Tourism is highly dependent on it, as are a number of other stakeholders. And we have a very, very strong non-governmental sector with strong interests in wildlife and in the environment. So there's a series of different standalone research pieces that inform this, particularly with regards to poaching statistics, with regards to consumptive use. There's been a lot of debate around consumptive use, drawing on the experiences of other countries. All of this was put forward, and all of this had been all of these different pieces of research had been gathered, particularly during the previous policy review processes. So we had some very strong experts in the sector that were doing that and using that and putting it forward in previous policy processes. Now, this was quite important because there was no repository in place at the time to really gather and collect and stock take the different pieces of evidence during prior policy processes and also map out why decisions were made at the different points in which they were made. So that had been lost to this particular committee to a large extent, and Ahmed can add it to me. Apart from the fact that the two leaders and the leadership here had been involved in previous, so they were able to draw on their own individual experience and knowledge. So this is one of in terms of a structure of gathering evidence, I think this was one of the gaps that was identified during the case study. And really, this is one of the recommendations that emerged from this. The Parliament needs to establish a knowledge management, a better or strengthen their knowledge management system in this regard. Ahmed, do you want to add to this?
I think you basically covered, but the issue of how we managed to record this evidence, I talked about certain matrices that we developed and putting questions to members during the discussion about the trade-offs and what they wanted. If they wanted that preference carried, or they didn't want it, they wanted that replaced, then what was their issue? And one of the things that developed from this hearing was a matrix to say, okay, what is the provision in the piece of legislation? What is the amendments they are seeking? What are the new additions they want to bring in? And what is the reason for this? So they had to give those clarifications in terms of, I wouldn't say, and I'm not making a statement to say everything that came before the committee was accepted. No, it was kind of balancing to see the decision to take a certain view or evidence or leave it was dependent upon the committee itself in the internal hearing process. And I will add that to some questions that I've also seen about the adequacy of this and how do you know it's effective. This particular evidence is where we were. Remember, there is a proposal that comes at that time came from the executive to the committee, and that particular proposal underwent so many amendments, and those amendments were majorly informed by the evidence provided by the stakeholders. For us, we can tell in terms of whether this evidence was influential to change the policy, the proposals that were there, on the basis of the evidence itself that we have in our matrices, and looking at the proposed amendments and finally the output of the piece of legislation that is there.
So may I add to this?
Yes, please go ahead.
I think the matrix, as the researcher on this case study, when we first heard about the matrix, we didn't pay it a lot of attention. So the more we understood, the more we realized how central it was to the successes of this particular policy, in the sense that it allowed for transparency. Now, some of the previous policies had failed because there was a sense of there was lack of transparency. Public participation process had taken place, views were put forward, a policy was crafted, it went to the executive, And then something happened. This was a story we were told as we were doing the research. Then something happened to it inside of the executive. And what came out and was presented to Parliament, sorry, there's an echo, I think. Ian, do you mind muting your mic? There's a bit of an echo. What came out to Parliament was unrecognizable, and it stalled. And it was that in that particular case, it was hijacked. The leadership knew this history and understood this history and the significance of ensuring that at every step of the way there was a transparent process. And this very simple matrix allowed for that. It allowed for the tracking of discussions, and it allowed right at the very end for the final decisions to be made clear to individuals. What was accepted, what was not accepted. Having said that, again, as we've said, it's a political process at the end of the day. So in spite of all of the work that went into it, at the 12th hour, a very critical piece of the policy, and this was related to compensation, was overturned at the third reading. And that was changed, and that was changed on the basis of a political decision that took place within the Parliament sitting itself. And you can see the repercussions of that, because that did not follow the evidence, that was not based on a sound and robust decision-making process. That particular decision on consumptive use has almost sunk the policy because it's unimplementable. So it was a very, very strong act of the leadership recognizing the political processes, recognizing what drives individual members of Parliament, and ensuring that it was able to balance it, coupled with a very strong and well-organized civil society as well.
All right. Thanks, Amini and Ahmed, for those responses. I think there are a few questions that have been raised as well regarding the framework for doing the public hearings and so on. I think Ian responded in one of the chats there to say that as a result of this project, and I think you also highlighted that in the presentation, that a framework was actually developed on how to do this. The project, the initiative helped Parliament to come up with this framework. Somebody has asked that, has this been adopted really? Is it now being used by other committees in Parliament? So maybe Ahmed, you can respond to that. But a related question that Leonard Tiringamawa has asked, and it's also related to what Anne Kasakara has asked, relates to the issue of how best really to make parliamentary research and knowledge brokers in the region. How do you make sure that they are really serving their communities, and how do you make sure that you improve capacity and your standards of operation and harmonization? I think Anne Kasakara had asked a question about the knowledge management platform in the Kenyan Parliament that has apparently been developed. Has it been operationalized? Ahmed, do you want to respond to those? One about whether there's a knowledge platform operationalization in the Kenyan Parliament. Second is the issue about what happened to this framework that was developed as a result of this process for doing public hearings. Is it now institutionalized in Parliament? And also, if you can just comment on how knowledge brokers, people like yourself in the region, can actually harmonize the work that you are doing.
So let me start with what I do, the knowledge brokering and how that works out. First, we do not broker knowledge for the public. We do it for the benefit of the members. Remember, it's not our product. Ours is technical support. We are silent and behind the scene group that works on this. So the skill of a knowledge broker is to know your area and to understand the issue at hand itself. So you just have to be ahead of the game yourself and ensure that you're interacting as much as possible with the evidence itself and the suppliers of the evidence before you even come to the demand and the usage of that evidence. And so it's a whole technical department that deals with policy and evidence generation. So it's not something specific to one knowledge broker and a skill. It's a whole skill that exists in the institution itself. Whether this framework is in use, yes, but I wouldn't say, and I said it's sector specific. The framework is there, but it's not coded. So you can take what you like in that framework and use it. So I wouldn't say it's something that was approved in a sitting. That's a document that is recognized and being used now. But of course, it has found relevance in terms of how important that framework is in collecting public evidence and evidence from stakeholders. Is there anything I left earlier? Sorry.
I think it's mainly the question about the framework for doing public hearings. Has it been institutionalized now in Parliament?
No, I said it's there. It's being used, but I say it isn't. It isn't an institutionalized thing that has been approved. This is how you do it. So it's also still sector specific in terms of how you want to use it and what additions you can add or what you can subtract. It's up to you when you're using it, but it certainly is found relevance in terms of usage.
All right. Another question that has come up. There was mention about involvement of public media, and so Makue, is it Makue Kumaro is asking the question. I heard a point about the role of media in the public participation process. What media specifically? Are you talking mainly about commercial media? To what extent were community media platforms used to obtain diverse voices of people in other communities, e.g. rural and so on? I think this is also related to the question that, to an area question that now I can't see how to remove one of these options here, which is hanging on my thing. But there was a question that a colleague also asked to say that to what extent do you control, even when you say you are consulting the community, is it just a few community, the gatekeepers, and you are not really hearing from the common people? And I think this question about what media, was it community radios, for instance, that allow the broader spectrum of people to participate in these public participatory processes? Would you like to comment on that, the media question? I think that's Ahmed as well, is it? Mine, or Mine, do you want to comment on that?
I can help.
Yeah.
He's been put in the spotlight a bit much, so but he is the expert. I think the issue of media and outreach was one of the shortcomings that was identified in the case study. Essentially, only mainstream media was used, and mainly English-speaking newspapers. So this was a big gap, obviously, in terms of outreach, particularly given the reality that the stakeholders who have most to gain or to lose are in wildlife-rich areas, very far removed. I mean, it can take them a week to get a newspaper. What you had to try and offset this, and this was not deliberate, this was just the context and the reality, is one, we have constituencies, wildlife constituencies, conservancies that in Kenya, and they are owned by communities. There's an established platform, the Kenya Wildlife Conservation Alliance, that represents and forms a network for the conservancy. So this was a voice, and this had been working over time to really reach out to local communities, and it offered them a sort of the means to level the playing ground. You also had members of parliament. Now, we recognize that members of parliament are they're influenced by a number of different reasons in terms of how they act. But one of the key pressure points is their own constituencies. And in this case, we had members of parliament that came from wildlife-rich areas. So it was, it was wise and necessary of them to reach out and engage in dialogue with their own constituencies and ensure this was tabled. And then you had the NGO community as well, who had been working in a variety of different areas, consulting with community members, and they acted as a liaison point. So it was by no means as it should be. It was not ideal, and there's a lot to be learned from it. And this is really what we're hoping comes out from this particular case, that some of these lessons are taken up, and for them to be taken up, they need to be heard by beyond just Parliament. Maybe Ahmed wants to add to this.
Mina, I think that's good enough. You kind of clarified the media. Of course, it's a huge challenge for Parliament, and we're talking about the framework on how to engage. We certainly know there is a challenge in terms of, putting a public advert in the newspaper. How many people read that? Who has access to newspaper? Those are the issues. And I talked about this particular issue in terms of those who read, reaching out to communities and bringing community members to the public hearing. It's kind of a snowball for this particular hearing. But it's not every piece of legislation will have such an advantage, for sure. So I think it's something in development. And once this legal framework is established, probably, then we can have maybe a part of the recommendations I think we make in this case is certainly to see how widespread public participation can get.
All right, thank you. I think there's a question that, parliaments, we talk about parliaments, they look like they are the same. I mean, there's maybe the Commonwealth set of parliaments. There are other parliaments that operate differently. But Martha Bridgman wanted really to know, I think she's comparing with the South African context and saying, are parliamentarians accountable to particular constituencies in the Kenyan political system? I ask, as the electoral system in South Africa may cut across accountability to anything but the party whips due to the pure PR electoral setup and the primacy of the party whip over voters. Accountabilities of MPs, do you just want to respond to that in terms of the Kenyan structure?
Well, I will respond in terms of the process and the members of the committee at that time, not generally in the Kenyan context. That I do not have the leverage to speak about. But I will give you an example of what was happening. This committee had a number of members from the pastoral communities. They had a number of professionals who are in the conservation sector. So there was issue of wildlife and domestic animals and the conflict between the wildlife and domestic animals. And the pastoralists who live adjacent to the protected areas, who are the main protectors of this wildlife, how will they get advantage from or benefit or derive benefit from wildlife? And one of the contention at that time, I remember, was, is it possible for them to graze their animals in protected areas during emergencies? Say there was a drought or famine, and the only place that had a pasture was in these protected areas or the parks or reserves. And if it happened that they drove their animals into that, then what would be the penalty? And so there's a lot of negotiation in terms of reaching an agreement. So that is an extent of accountability to their constituents, arguing, yes, we should allow, but we should structure the process. And that you will find in the legislation, it's been captured. And then in terms of penalty, if they happen and they do not know how to do it, and they did, then what will the penalty be? If you look at the legislation, the act now, you will see the penalty is really low. So that was also a negotiation amongst the members of parliament, despite the fact that the pressure groups and certain conservationists were saying, this is very destructive, we should increase the penalty. But when it came to discussion and members from the pastoral community standing up for the interest of their specific communities or constituents, then they found that relevance in it. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Maybe Mine, there are a couple of other questions here. I thank everybody. We are still here. But Claire Kidombo has asked a question about the issue about feedback mechanism. What would you recommend with regard to feedback mechanism in a public participation framework? This may be part of the reason that communities feel there is no uptake of evidence or that they are not being held. I think Josephine Watera also raised the same issue, this issue about public participation. You talked about now developing a framework on how to do this, but the questions about who really in the public, how deep, how many, and so on, I think that's an issue that that has been raised, has been responded to partly, but I think as we are going down towards wrapping up this, you can think about adding some comments there. But also, Chikondi Mwendera also raised the issue that this is the issue about involving the communities is very, very good to matters that impact them. But then she has a question, do you have any views on how this process can be replicated to scrutinize foreign investors before they come to Africa? And what guarantee can we have for that we have for the views of the communities to be held in this respect? I think I think it's issues to do with community participation, what feedback mechanism you should have, how can you apply it to other development issues, and so on. Would you like just to comment on that?
Yeah, okay, I'll try and offer a brief comment on it. In terms of the feedback mechanism, there's the matrix that we just talked about, and very carefully tracking what the submissions were and what the decision was on against each of those submissions from the public. And that has to be made available. So this is one of the shortcomings. We heard a lot of people that were interviewed were grumbling about the act in itself, and we said this and we said that, but it was never heard and listened to. And we ask a simple question, have you read the act? And they hadn't read the act. So that really then, it doesn't stop there. The process cannot stop there. I think some of the important things linked to the other questions as well is the process does not begin when the act begins, with the review, the policy process begins, and it does not end when the policy process ends. So there has to be a great deal of effort that goes into creating awareness around the policy after the act has actually comes into being. This is then linked to one of the other questions is how do you know the participation was effective? How do you rate it? One of the interesting findings in this particular case were the number of non-governmental organizations who then took it upon themselves to translate the act and create practical guidelines for the wider community. So there was a clear sense of ownership and understanding of it for them to then popularize and invest in popularizing this act, which they would not have done had they not agreed with it and had they not had a sense of ownership. In terms of participatory processes, I think there's a wealth of information out there on knowledge and lessons on good participation that has emerged from the development sector. How do you undertake a stakeholder analysis? How do you map out a stakeholder engagement strategy? How do you ensure voice and avoid elite capture, et cetera, et cetera? I think bodies like Parliament might do well from borrowing from some of this wealth of knowledge that already exists in the development sector and perhaps adapting it to the policy process itself. I think that answers, did I miss any? I think that answers, I hope that answers those questions.
Oh yeah, I think the other question is the one by Elizabeth Kahurani. Maybe it goes to Ahmed as well. To what extent was the devolution system and structures useful in the process of public participation, that is getting views from counties? It seems a lot of the engagement was done with civil society or communities. Did you involve the county government officials themselves, Ahmed? That's, I think, basically the question.
This was early in the onset of the devolution process. Remember, we were starting to implement devolution at that time. In that first election that happened in 2013, this piece of legislation was coming in 2013. Later on, yes, of course, there is a whole house that is in charge of protecting the counties and county government, the Senate. And I'm sure they share their legislations with the county assemblies. Part of the thing I participated, and I talked about the liaison office, was to share with county assemblies legislations that were before the Senate. So that is happening at that level. To what extent that is productive or authentic or effective, then I would not be able to tell. But just let me take another question related to feedback and about post-legislative scrutiny. I think yes, and this it also happened in this piece of legislation. Once the legislation was done, enacted in December 2013, in 2014 there was another process to start the amendment of this piece of legislation immediately, because many stakeholders found, and even parliamentarians among them found, there were a lot of issues that were rushed during this process. There were things that needed to be amended, and this was subjected to a technical team. So this team consisted of, came from judiciary, DPP, that's Director of Public Prosecution, civil society, Kenya Wildlife Society, a certain group, a technical advisory group to look at, is the piece of legislation meeting the intended objective? And a host of amendments were made. That particular piece of amendment legislation was published in 2016, and before it went through the processes, then the parliament came to an end. So I believe post-legislative scrutiny is an important process to see the implementability, the enforceability of the provisions of any particular piece of legislation.
All right, thank you. I think maybe also addressed to you, Ahmed, before you. I know you've been on the firing range for quite a while in terms of answering a lot of the questions. But Talita Mraka is actually asking you. She's talking about the specific challenges of the knowledge brokering role, but asking, in essence, what would you say is the key knowledge brokering skill working in a parliamentary setup? Like in the Kenyan parliament?
Well, a number, but the most important skill is to silently do your job. You shouldn't be seen anywhere in the process.
Silently
do your job.
All right.
In that sense, yes, of course, the research team is a technical department that has the skill to analyze, collect information, and do briefs, be able to summarize policies and legislation in a way members of parliament can easily understand. Remember, members of parliament come from different professional backgrounds. So you need to understand your clients and who you're dealing with, and ensure that the information that you are putting on the table is something that is worth to be used for decision. So you really have to have the knowledge to do that. So you have to have the technical expertise in terms of doing that. And of course, as I said, do it silent.
Right. Josephine Watera actually highlights the importance of your role in parliaments. At AFIDEP, we also work with strengthening capacity of parliaments in using evidence. And I think the point she makes that knowledge brokers and evidence gatekeepers are key in the context of parliament, because they are the institutional memory of parliament even after political landscape. We know in Africa, we tend to lose 70+% of MPs, they come and go. But I think building capacity of the office, like the Parliamentary Research Services Office in Kenya, is really very, very central. So thanks, Josephine, for highlighting that point. Ben Jarabi actually throws in a very provocative question. I don't know whether this forum can exhaust answering it, but he talks about members of parliament have completely refused to see reason for promoting small family size in Kenya despite the available evidence. They rather look at the potential political gain in terms of the number of voters. I think those are some of the political realities that we face with our parliamentarians and so on. So I don't know whether Ahmed, you want to put a quick comment on that. But maybe I want to put Ian and Mene on the spot regarding the book itself. I mean, it's a very, very important book. Ahmed, do you want to say something maybe as your parting shot? I just want to ask 1-2 questions in general about what Mene and Ian have really learned. Just to summarize, what are the main lessons from the book in terms of the totality of it? But Ahmed, do you want to say maybe, I think we've kind of exhausted the questions that are there. Would you like to maybe say your summary of what you've really learned from this and also just what would be your parting shot as far as the study is concerned and given the questions people have asked?
Mina, do you want to go first? Okay, so I mean, I think one of the key takeaways for us has been that context really matters, and there are quite a lot of issues around context. Mina sort of referred to them a little bit when she looked at the framework and how you need to adjust your process depending on the context, the internal factors and leadership, etc., the external factors, what's happening in terms of elections and crises, etc. So that's one aspect, context matters. And so understanding the context, so for example, at times maybe doing a diagnostic to really understand that context and what interventions might be appropriate. Another thing is that we need to be very purposive about the evidence use interventions that we do. We're used to thinking about, well, we need to collect this evidence. We need to do this research, or we need to do an evaluation, some rapid synthesis. But we need to be very conscious about what we're doing to try and make sure that the capability, opportunity, and motivation are there to use the evidence. And so we need to learn a new set of skills around dialogue processes, around workshops, around knowledge brokering, etc., and around facilitating processes which get evidence into use. And that means, for example, that M&E units, whether it's in Parliament or in government, also need to learn new skill sets. And those skill sets about involving multiple stakeholders, about facilitating processes from well before you needed the evidence to through the generation into the use process. Those are skill sets that we need to learn and we need to recruit for. So those will be some of the key takeaways that we've got.
Mina, you want to go next in terms of summing up the discussion that we've had, what you look at as the key lessons from the Kenya study, but also your broader sort of view about the key lessons from the book.
I think a lot of it has been already said, but one of the things that really strikes me again and again is the complexity of it. You know, every time I listen to Ahmed, I learn something new about this case, and I was the researcher on it, quite immersed in this particular case study from a sector that I know very well. And I think because of the complexity of it and the importance of really understanding the multiplicity of factors that can influence this really brings out the value of having an analytical framework like this. So just to be able to take some time to unpack it and to see the different elements as well as the relationship between these elements, I think was really quite important. Thank you.
Ahmed, you have more or less the last word on this. Your sort of parting shots on this, your big lessons from this, and advice as well to all of us who work in this knowledge brokerage field.
Well, I certainly share with the lessons spelled out by Ian and Mina. But for Parliament, I think one thing that we've learned through this process is important to document issues and have a storage or repository of information or data related to every sector. For instance, this particular piece of legislation has been parliamentary entry for a while. If that information was kept somewhere within Parliament, so that we could easily access and go back to where it originated and how it originated, that will be important and move the process forward. And of course, the knowledge brokers need to have the necessary skills to be of value to legislators and policymakers, ensure that the right questions are asked, and ensure the right things are being negotiated at the decision table. And then certainly feedback is important. One thing that we've seen in this is members or public come before legislators or policymakers, give out their views or state their views, but nobody ever goes back to them and say, thank you very much. This was very helpful, and this helped in us understanding one or two, three things. This kind of will continue to build the trust in policymakers and legislators, and that is certainly a missing link within these policy and legislative processes. Thank you.
All right. We still have 12 minutes to spare, but I believe that all the questions that were put in the Q&A box have been responded to. And I would like really to, I think this has been a very great discussion for me as somebody who basically, wakes up and goes to sleep after just thinking about evidence-informed decision-making, how we really put evidence at the center of development in Africa. And a lot of times, I think the issue about parliaments is an issue that is overlooked a lot, but our parliaments play a very critical role. You look at the Kenyan parliament since 2010, in the 2010 constitution, the role of parliament was changed quite substantially. You can look at even budgets before. The Minister of Finance used just to come with their budget to parliament, and whatever they read there becomes law. There was no substantive engagement with parliament, but now there have to be negotiations that happen before the budget is actually presented there. So parliamentarians have a critical role. They can intervene, they can influence resource allocation, their role as legislators, and their role, even the more critical role, is the role of parliamentarians in providing oversight. Many of us can be wonderful researchers and so on, but it's the Parliamentary Committee for Health that can actually call the minister to say, what are you doing about COVID? Which many of us don't have that authority to do. So I think for me, I would like to commend the inclusion of this chapter in the book on lessons on evidence use in parliaments, because I think, if anything, it should get all of us who are working in evidence-informed decision-making to realize that when we look at government, it's not just the executive arm of government, but parliament actually has a critical role. And parliament tends to have much poorer capacity in terms of the people who make the decisions. In government, you look around now, the PSs, the directors, they have PhDs, masters, they have all gone to universities. But in parliament, people come because they are voted in. Some could have been people who are not that well educated, who may not understand this. So how do you help to make sure that evidence plays a role in helping parliamentarians make decisions, these big decisions that they make about improving the well-being, creating laws, and so on? How do you make sure? So I think it's a very important part of Africa's development, focusing on parliament. And I think I'd like to commend you, Ahmed and Mine, and the authors for documenting this process and drawing out the lessons that we have. So really, I believe evidence makes a big difference in policy making, but I'm part of the choir. I believe that a lot of you here believe the same. What this book, what these chapters have done is actually to demonstrate how the use of evidence, and in this particular case, combining that evidence use with public participation, how that can unlock a policy process that's stored for over 16 years. And I think we can all learn from this and believe that really, if we are very structured, if we focus on really I think it keeps going off and on. So I had said my goodbye, but it looks like I had been switched off. Congratulations to the presenters. Thanks to all of you who participated. We still have 35 people now, 2 hours down the line since we started this. I just really want to thank everybody. Congratulate the editors of the book, Mine and Ian, and Ahmed for the great case study for Kenya. And so at this point, we will end the webinar, and I thank all of you for participating. All the best. Be safe. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for moderating.
Thank you. No worries. You're welcome.
Have a good evening.
Thank you. Have a good evening. Bye.
Everybody.